Hello, and welcome to Unsung Stories, Women at Columbia's Computer Music Center. I'm Ellie Hassama, Professor of Music at Columbia.
And I am Zasha DeCastri, Assistant Professor of Music and Composition at Columbia. We are the co-organizers of this weekend's online symposium.
We're so glad to have you all here with us today to celebrate 7 decades of women making music at the Columbia-Princeton Electronic Music Center, now known as the Computer Music Center. We would like to begin by acknowledging that we are speaking from the unceded traditional land of the Munsee Lenape, known today as Harlem. We wish to recognize the history of colonization and settlement here, where Columbia University sits since its founding in 1754 by royal charter of King George II of England. We must remember that the U.S. government forced the migration of the Lenape from this land to Oklahoma, where many descendants of those who were removed now reside.
In addition, we acknowledge the numerous enslaved Africans and their descendants whose forced labor contributed to the wealth of many educational institutions and this nation, and whose sacrifice have not yet been compensated nor adequately recognized to this day. This violence underwrites the history of our academic institution and all who live and work in Harlem. Please take a moment to consider the lives, culture, and legacy of these groups as we honor and pay our respect for their contributions to our school and society. Let us move forward considering the following. Who gets the right to name or be named? Whose stories are honored in name? And whose are erased?
We would like to thank all the participants. I'm hearing echo. We would like to thank all the participants. I'm sorry, there's some terrible echo. Do you hear that, Sasha?
I can continue.
Okay.
We would like to thank all the participants who have given of their time and expertise this weekend, as well as the generosity of our funders who have made this event possible. We would like to give special thanks to the Center for Science and Society, the Office of the Vice Provost for Faculty Advancement, the Committee on Equity and Diversity, Arts and Sciences, and the Society of Fellows Heyman Center for the Humanities, who are hosting this webinar. For a complete list of sponsors, please see the symposium booklet, which is available as a downloadable PDF on the registration page. There should be a link in the chat. We would also like to mention, as some of you may know, that the graduate workers of Columbia went on strike in March for a fair contract, including the right to third-party neutral arbitration. Owing to the complicated logistics of coordinating such a large number of speakers from all over the world, we decided to move forward with the online symposium as scheduled. But we would like to reiterate that we stand in solidarity with the Graduate Student Union and hope for a just outcome in their negotiations. Before we begin with our programming, we would like to address a few matters of logistics. Throughout the symposium, the audience can type questions in the Q&A box. The moderators will then read questions aloud to the panelists. Please note these sessions will also be recorded and can be accessed through the Heyman Center and the Unsung Stories websites. An email will go out to all participants and registered attendees when the videos become available. Please also note that closed captioning is available for the duration of the event. And now I am happy to introduce our first speaker. Bridget Cohen is Associate Professor of Music at New York University. Her book, Stefan Wulp and the Avant-Garde Diaspora, won the Lockwood Award from the American Musicological Society. Her forthcoming book, Musical Migration and Imperial New York, explores questions of displacement and citizenship through a study of New York concert avant-gardes, jazz, electronic music, and performance art in the 1950s and 60s, and from it you can learn more about the CPEMC. We have invited Professor Cohen to give a short early history of the CPEMC CMC to help set the stage for our conversations this week. Thank you, Bridget, for joining us today.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here at this very important event. And thank you, Ellie and Zasha, for your extraordinary planning and all of your dedication in making these events possible. In 1959, the Columbia-Princeton Electronic Music Center, or CPEMC, was founded on the Columbia campus with the support of a massive $175,000 Rockefeller Foundation grant. The CPEMC was the first institutionally supported electronic music center of its kind in the United States, founded with the aim to compete with studios in Cologne, Paris, Milan, and Tokyo. The project was 8 years in the making, and it involved extensive collaboration between Barnard and Columbia faculty Otto Luning and Vladimir Ussachevsky, who teamed up with engineer Peter Mose alongside Milton Babbitt at Princeton University. Ussachevsky's wife, Elizabeth Cray, served as an unacknowledged co-founder who smoothed over relations with the Rockefeller Foundation, helped to write their award-winning grant application, and completed extensive administrative work connected with the studio. In existing historical narratives, Columbia University's music department has become known as an anchor of the, quote, uptown scene, a term that connotes the transplantation of notated Second Viennese School compositional methods onto American soil. Yet the CPEMC was always more diverse than the mythology of uptown acknowledges. The CPEMC was founded as a hub for cultural diplomacy, in keeping with Rockefeller Foundation objectives to enhance US soft power abroad during the Cold War. Robert Gluck shows how the studio hosted visitors from throughout the world in the 1960s and 70s, with large contingents from Latin America, Eastern Europe, the Middle East and Turkey, East Asia, and at least one composer, Stephen Agbanega, from West Africa, and Chinri Ung from Southwest Asia. It's little known that the first foreign-born visiting composer at the CPEMC was Michiko Toyama from Japan, followed by Halim Eldab from Egypt. Both pursued quasi-ethnographic compositional aesthetics grounded in tape recording, splicing, and manipulation. Gender diversity characterized the early years of the studio as much as ethnic, racial, and national diversity. Ussachevsky was a rare composer who mentored women composers, and Luning advocated for women professionally. The composer and Columbia faculty member Bülent Arel, a central force in the studio community, strongly respected women as creators, something to which Daria Semigan, Prill Smiley, and Alice Shields, who worked with him closely, testify. The CPEMC of the late 1950s and 60s constituted a rare compositional community where women found a degree of mentorship, advocacy, and exposure to internationalism. Still, their financial compensation never equaled that of their male colleagues. Women and composers of color continued to face discrimination in the institutions of classical music, higher education, and technoculture, as reflected in patterns of critical reception and material support. The patronage of the Rockefeller Foundation, or RF, in particular, was an engine for inequality at the studio. After the foundation had awarded its massive 1959 grant to the CPEMC, it followed up with smaller grants to individual composers. In the 1950s, the RF Humanities Division explicitly sought to promote projects of what they called interculturality. And this move encouraged Ussachevsky and Luning to embrace composers such as Toyama and Eldab at the CPEMC as a Rockefeller-supported studio. Over the course of the early 1960s, however, the RF moved aggressively toward a rubric of genius in its evaluation of applicants. The persona of the artist as genius originated in European Romantic thought. It suggests a value system that is heavily gendered and racialized, associated with a lineage of white male creativity. While the studio continued to sponsor composers from all over the world, and Ussachevsky as director nurtured a kind of stylistic eclecticism, the language of RF funding decisions shifted emphatically toward narrow ideas of genius. And just to give one example, I found in one evaluation for a grant, the officer explained in 1966, quote, "We did give an exceptional fellowship to Mario Davidovsky on the grounds of his exceptional genius," end of quote. And I'm not saying that the grant wasn't deserved, but I am saying that the language through which the decisions were made, it was a very specific language of genius that tended to exclude people of color, women, just by virtue of the sort of persona and lineage that it evokes. Michael Uwe shows that Milton Babbitt became a particularly important arbiter for the RF during this time in the 1960s as the foundation underwent significant shifts in how it administered music grants. These developments contributed to the consolidation of Uptown as a label for music at Columbia and Princeton. Yet the label Uptown creates harm when it's applied uncritically to the CPEMC as a historical, object of remembrance. This term occludes and overlooks the very field of creativity we highlight here today. The events of this symposium recover the heterogeneity of the CPEMC while tracing out connections of gender, race, ethnicity, national origin, and other distinctions that characterized the community. I'd like to close my comments with 3 observations about women creators at the studio in the 1960s and 70s, comments that are directly pertinent to our conversations to come today. First, it was the women of the CPEMC who overwhelmingly assumed responsibility for analog-based instruction at the studio. Under these conditions in the 1960s, Prill Smiley and Alice Shields emerged as master teachers of a sonic craft that demanded new ways of coordinating mind, eye, ear, and body for the purpose of an expanded artistic imagination. As Alice Shields recalled, tape composition required that composers also be sculptors. Quote, "With tape, there was a visual and embodied relationship to sound that doesn't really exist in other forms of composition. You can't easily see a sound, but here, there was a physical, palpable thing. More than an analog, it was the sound. It was on there, the tape." What Prill and I were teaching was the actual practice, how you actually do this, how you cut the tape, in what way. It's not as transparent as it may seem until you actually do it, end of quote. This legacy of CPEMC women as sound sculptors continues with Daria Semigan, who teaches in a hybrid studio at Stony Brook University with the very analog technologies that Shields and Smiley mastered and demonstrated. My second point concerns the resourcefulness of women at the CPEMC. To be sure, they encountered barriers in institutions of classical music and the academy, yet they responded by completely revamping the terms of what it means to be a composer, taking advantage of the wildly promising, undomesticated media of the electronic studio. Michiko Toyama's electronic practice brought together Japanese classical literature and performance with the downtown spoken word scene and the European art song tradition. Alice Shields' career flourished when she adapted electronic music to the worlds of opera, musical theater, and other vocal genres. Prill Smiley introduced electronic sound to numerous theater productions at Lincoln Center after it opened. Later in the 1970s, Alida Vasquez collaborated with the Claudia Gittleman Dance Company. Unable to take for granted established career pathways, the women of the studio at Columbia set forth on their own projects from which new ways of listening, imagining, making a living, and collaborating across media settings emerged. Finally, in pursuing disparate projects and composerly personae, the women of the CPEMC emerged as critical mediators of its history. Few composers have contributed as steadily to the documentation, oral history, and archival preservation of the studio as have Prill Smiley and Alice Shields. Their work as instructors in the studio was always more than just instruction in the narrow sense. Their presence brings instruction in every sense: aesthetic, technical, poetic, moral, political. Instruction here also carries forward intuitive knowledge, bodily practice, and modes of listening that might otherwise fall outside the purview of conventional history. The legacies of the CPEMC women resound in their own acts of creativity and history making. whether in their creative works and performances or in their articles, CDs, generous testimony, and acts of archival preservation. And it is a great honor to hear their stories today as we convene our symposium. Thank you.
Thank you, Bridget, for your insightful introduction. What a perfect springboard for our keynote roundtable, Founding Figures. Please note that the Q&A for this session will be quite short to maximize the time for our panelists, but any remaining questions can be sent to the Unsung Stories email address, which we will direct to our panelists to continue the discussion after our event. Today, I have the great honor of introducing three incredibly influential women who have shaped the studio life at the CPEMC and CMC, and whose influence can still be felt today through their highly crafted music and pedagogical legacies. I will briefly introduce all three presenters in the order they will be speaking. Alice Shields creates cross-cultural electronic and acoustic operas and works for fixed media, voices, instruments, dance theater, video, and film. Her work is heavily influenced by non-Western forms of classical music and theater, such as No theater and Bharatanatyam dance drama. Shields was Associate Director of the CPEMC and a primary instructor in electronic music at the center from 1964 to 1982. She was then Associate Director for Development of the CMC in the 1990s. Shields holds 3 degrees from Columbia, including a DMA in composition, and has taught psychology of music at NYU and Rutgers. Daria Semigan is a composer of instrumental, vocal, and electronic music. She taught at Columbia-Princeton Electronic Music Center from 1971 to 75 and was a sound engineer at the Collection of World Musics. Her awards include 6 National Endowment for the Arts grants and the 2009 Susan B. Anthony Lifetime Achievement Award for its Center for Women's Leadership. Semigan is Associate Professor of Composition, Theory, and Electronic Music Composition at Stony Brook University, where she also serves as Director of the Electronic Music Studio. And Prill Smiley is a composer of electronic music with strong focus on writing for theater, film, and dance, having composed for over 40 productions. She became involved with the CPEMC in 1963, composed and taught at the center, and served as Associate Director for 25 years before retiring in 1995. She also served for 6 years as electronic music consultant for the Vivian Beaumont Theater at Lincoln Center. Smiley is the recipient of various awards and honors, including a Guggenheim Fellowship, a National Endowment for the Arts grant, a Creative Artists Public Service grant, and a New York Foundation for the Arts Fellowship. Thank you so much to our panelists for joining us today. And Alice, I'll invite you to begin our conversation on compositional craft at the CPEMC. Welcome. Can you unmute Alice? Let's hear. 1 second here. We're not hearing you.
I unmuted.
There we go. Thank you.
Thank you, Bridget, Sasha, Ellie, and everyone who put this very important Unsung Stories project together. I hope that we will all benefit through history documenting some of these things. I'm going to describe to you the sound sculpting techniques that Prill and I taught one-to-one to graduate students in composition at the CMC. The teaching at the CPEMC, we used to call it just the EMC, was entirely in recorded music and sound, in audio only. And the classes were designed for already trained composers of instrumental music. The classes were not designed for artists of other disciplines or for people who were not professional musicians. The music or sounds once created at the CPEMC were used in many contexts after they were created, including theater, dance, opera, film, with live instruments or voice, or even in arts therapies. But no form of theater, dance, opera, film, or any other application was actually taught at the center. The focus was entirely on the craft of recorded sound and nothing else. I believe this sole focus on audio, plus the already complete musical training of the composition students entering the electronic music course, was responsible for the overall quality of the music created at the CPEMC. The composers were graduate students in composition at Columbia, as well as invited composers, often well-known ones or very, musically mature ones from outside Columbia, from the US and abroad. The grad students in composition were required to take the first-year course in electronic music. To briefly describe the center, there were 4 to 5 studios that would be simultaneously in use, scheduled around the clock, in addition to 3 or 4 studios in what was then called Sheffield Hall, which is now Prentice. There was another in the basement of Dodge Hall next to Macmillan, now Miller Theater. And for several years, there was a small studio upstairs in Dodge in the music department. The electronic music classes themselves were rigorous and were focused on the incremental increase in skills to create clear musical effects. Typically, the beginning class in electronic music started with exercises in listening to, identifying, and carefully manipulating each parameter of recorded sound. Also, what very much taught was the constructing of timbres from scratch from electronic sine square or sawtooth generators. These were physical oscillators that could be found in physics labs at that time. And the project was to develop timbres overtone by overtone above these simple waveforms. Part of the great skill that had to be taught as much as it could was refining the ability to know for oneself the personal decision, what you want to edit out. And I believe almost any creative artist would know that is a really important part of creating your work. Another thing that had to be taught was to learn procedures in the studio by which one could improvise upon and further develop the sounds that while they were being structured and shaped. Later, the teaching could focus on how these sounds could be developed into phrases, into sections, and into a complete piece. The big difference for most composers working at the CPEMC was that this was composing by ear, not on paper. And particularly for classically trained composers, it's a totally different experience. No notation was usually involved. All editing was by listening to the recorded sound you had just made and deciding whether to keep it, modify it, or discard it. All sound manipulation was by ear, and all mixing was by ear. There were, in terms of visual cues, there were simple dB mixer panels on which you could see whether you were going over the limit into distortion, but otherwise there was no visible cue, as you certainly might have in various computer technologies. The other big difference in working at the studio for composers were you were making the sounds with your hands. It was on the tape, as it were, because it was recorded on the tape. So when you cut out, say, a 10-second piece of tape and held it in your hand, you were actually holding a sound. It was on the tape. This tactile perception of sound has an impact in a special way, I think, on the composer. Your ears, your hands, and your eyes are perceiving your sound in 3 completely different sense modalities. So this is eye, hand, and spatial phenomena, and it is a powerful experience, and I believe brings a sense of embodiment into the act of composing that otherwise, for most of us at least, doesn't exist. Further, this eye-hand spatial coordination and awareness tends to intensify both emotion and perception. The movements you as a composer needed to do at the CPEMC to accomplish all the things in that studio you needed to do involved your whole body as well. Analog electronic composition required constant physical movement between tape recorders, machines, or microphones, or something else. So I want to draw, although I do digital composition now, I'm very aware of what the difference is, at least to one's body. The total body experience and involvement in analog, this kind of old style classical analog technique, can be contrasted with the, I think, commonly felt disembodiment feeling when dealing long-term with digital technologies, in which one must usually, of course, stare at a screen. The immobility and the resulting displacement from bodily sensation can certainly lead in some people to alienation from sensory perception, and maybe even the eventual separation of emotion from sound. So the bodily movement at the CPEMC also kept one's hearing more closely attuned because of changes in difference as you moved around from the loudspeakers, and because one's vision was constantly changing direction as one moved about from machine to machine while recording or while listening. One's attention was separated from visual focus, which was simply helping you mechanically get from machine to machine, whereas your ears were listening to the loudspeakers. Attention was being drawn back to the actual sounds coming from the loudspeakers. But in computer music, of course, while listening, my visual focus is typically fixed in one place, on the program I'm using on the screen, or focused on other visual distractions on the scene. I find that fixed visual focus tends to cut down on one's full listening capability. There's no way around it. We're in digital and it's fine, but this is a difference. So moving into, after a composer was, say, adept in sound shaping with simple electronic waveforms, and I'll go in a moment into what that sound shaping might consist of, and after the composer had gained the ability to edit their work, basic source material could become more complex than simple electronic waveforms. For example, musique concrète, as it was usually referred to then, now it might be called just sampling. The musique concrète sound sources during the 60s and 70s were analogous in a way to the found objects coming up at that time in visual art. Any recorded material, from sampled instrumental or vocal sounds to environmental sounds, could be considered valid to transform and organize into an electronic composition. For example, Vladimir Ussachevsky, with my help and Prill's help, had us create, he recorded them, a complete recorded library of brass instrument sounds with different mutes, separate notes, the whole thing. He used these sounds in his piece Of Wood and Brass, and other composers sometimes use some of these sounds too, including me. Those are examples of very traditional music sound sources a composer could choose as beginning source material. But of course, any recorded sound source would do. For example, the composer Anne Macmillan, whose work is radically unknown, but she was truly a pioneer in creating electronic music based on environmental sounds. The recordings of whales and dolphins had just become available for the first time in the 60s, and people were amazed to hear them. But Anne did actual music based on them. Any record, so, oh yeah, right. So I also used sounds of animals, wolves, but recordings I made myself of coyotes on a National Endowment for the Arts grant out west. And I use those in my electronic opera Shaman. So any recorded material whatsoever was considered valid to start a composition with, presuming, checking the time, presuming you had already absorbed the principles of sound shaping. So I'm going to rush ahead because I could speak probably for an hour, and I will go to, I think one of the most important things I could say about the CPEMC is freedom of style led to, I think in many composers' cases, individuality of style. The music department's ideology was serialism, but not the CPEMC. There was no ideology, and this was due to the leadership of Vladimir Ussachevsky, the director, and under him, Bülent Arel, a faculty member for that period. The composer was free to examine and to imagine themselves in ways they may not have musically before. And that is by exploring musical preferences. I feel that the CPEMC was, for most students, a kind of precious few years in which, without any pressure from, say, the music department or outside forces, when they would leave and have to get a job somewhere, and inevitably, wherever you go, there are pressures on you as an artist not to do, it's the case, not to do exactly what you feel. So at the CPEMC, we helped the students do this, find their preferences, because no trained composer was used to doing this, so that the things we suggested were, I might say to the student, listening to this sound you just made, do you prefer that going through this filter or the one you did before? And they have to listen to both of them and decide. A very simple kind of procedure applied to any parameter. So to wrap up, I want to mention that if you wish to read a description of the equipment and the analog sound manipulation techniques that were used at the CPEMC, I wrote a description of these things in an album I produced for New World Records called Columbia-Princeton Electronic Music Center, 1961 to 73. You can find the liner notes on which I wrote these things. They're available downloaded free on the New World Records website, newworldrecords.org. So I'm gonna just say one more thing, and that I do believe that the contribution of the CPEMC was that various styles, individual styles of composers were enhanced. That is very rare. So there was stylistic diversity there that hardly existed elsewhere. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alice Shields. It's wonderful to hear about that diversity and also the physicality involved in these early production of electronic music. So now I'll pass to Daria. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And so interesting to hear what Alice had to say, and I highly recommend her liner notes and all of her detailing of techniques and thinking processes and ways of managing with available equipment at CPEMC in those years. So that's actually an important record of in both ways, as a recording and in Alice's important liner notes. I remember being asked to join the CPEMC in teaching after I spent 2 years experimenting at the Yale Electronic Music Studio, where I was totally initially not interested in working in electronic music because of my hideous experience with Cologne radio type of education in Europe on a Fulbright, and which consisted of sitting in a classroom-like setting at the radio studio and having in front of us a thick glass wall behind which was the electronic music studio, and inside of which there were technicians in, mind you, white jackets, coats, as if it were a medical lab. And these were the people who had hands-on work on the equipment. So this was my introduction to electronic music, and having to produce a written diagram type score using trigonometric tables and various charts and indications, graphics for volume levels, what we would call conventionally envelopes. So all of these various areas were dealt with in the manner of an instrumental piece. And since I had experience for years with instrumental music, having started composition around age 7 or 8, this was no news to me and not of particular interest. And by that time, I had delved into, as an undergrad at Eastman, actually into history of art and drawing and painting and scenic design, and actually had paintings in the mezzanine exhibit for several seasons. So this was an area that I wanted to further explore the thinking in. And this new medium of electronic music in that way did not represent anything that would strike my interest and imagination. So when I did get to Yale, I met Bulent Arel, and he basically, after I gave him my impression of electronic music, of what I thought it was, as a way of working, he didn't disagree with me. He simply kept smoking his cigarette in the hallway, and he took out keys on a long chain, and then he took out a key and he handed it to me, and he said, "If you don't mind, the room number is," and he gave me the room number. He said, "Go and see what you do there." Okay, so I was glad to be able to explore and do trial and error all by myself, and could make my mistakes and have to correct. And as an autodidact, naturally, then this was really the best experience, is doing it step by step and harnessing troubleshooting in any which way possible, meaning being resourceful in a limited studio setting. So I produced some short tapes there, and Arel had given these to Ussachevsky in New York, and Ussachevsky then contacted me and asked if I could come to the studio. So I after a couple of years, quit Yale and switched to Columbia University to their DMA program, but mostly to work in the studio. And I must say it was glorious because it was open season on anything you want to do, and imagine in the studio without any interference. So this was good. I did not need to have any particular guidance, because the way I work, I have to simply do my own thing and go over things and create a process that will result in what is happening with possibilities and experimentation without being distracted by a lot of other things. So I find these days are certainly more difficult also in academia, because there are so many distractions, and also the culture of availability and assumption of availability 24/7 puts us psychologically under duress daily with obligations, etc., which again is highly distracting to creative imagination. And when I think about human beings and arts, I realize that our involvement is practically involuntary from the beginning of the existence of something called imagination, which is one of these soft words, soft value words, and that's too bad, along with creativity. Oh, what could that be? Another a dangerous word in academia, or something like inspiration. But these are all very important human traits. They're not soft values. So what if we make administrators uncomfortable by putting them into syllabuses? They are essential. They are important to our humanity and to our pursuit of existence as human beings. It's not by accident that cave paintings were made, or that eventually we found out that there's a very ancient flute that was made eons ago out of an animal bone. These things are all evidence of human imagination. And if academia is going to support anything, they should encourage that. And they should accept that these things are not coming from a given process, but from ambiguities. And these ambiguities were certainly encouraged at Columbia-Princeton Electronic Music Center. And someone like Musachevsky was wise enough to wait and see what production would happen from individual imaginations and inspirations and backgrounds and cultures. So there was that encouragement of wisdom there, where he said fewer things, but you knew that there would be an overall aura of support for creativity, another awfully soft value word in the world of academia. Of course, I'm being facetious about it, but that's a part of what we face. Precisionism, the assumption of precisionism, by the way, and that is a recognized art style and movement earlier in the 20th century. So we have to be careful about data and its interpretation and interpreters. And we have to stick to our determination as creators to persist in emphasizing the importance of these so-called ambiguous values in creativity. So I think one of the most important things in dealing with electronic music sounds is to learn how to listen, meaning pay attention. And we cannot have the same mindset as we may have just scrolling through things on our cell phones, meaning we are used to a certain speed of information passing across our attention. And that's just not adequate enough. So listening repeatedly and sound tasting with your ears. So ear tasting, becoming a sound gourmet is what you want in instrumental music and in electronic music especially. We in instrumental music have become quite elaborate in our extended techniques, pushing, etc., which is wonderful extension of language in the instrument world. But also we need to be more discerning and actually as fussy as we are with instrument sounds when we work with electronic medium, especially with digital software, which I remind myself comes from other people's imaginations. And we cannot have those imaginations be your boss when you're composing. So you may set other boundaries with your imagination and have other artistic demands in your piece than what the software may be willing to provide you. So these awarenesses, I think, are essential for teachers and students to keep us in a place where we have a healthy perspective on the situation and are able to then cope, because it's also a matter of coping in today's world, psychologically, physically, and in working methods. And I'm very glad that Alice Shields mentioned the visual software distraction. When we're looking at a screen, we are using a percentage of our attention that is not used for audio awareness, and that simply is a fact. And we need to open our awareness to our circumstance in choosing, because ultimately the job of an artist, of a composer, is to choose. And we must do it as carefully as we can afford to in a piece. And as a final thing, I must admit that the process of making pieces is often very messy and not neat. And that's the way it needs to be. That's fine. And it's something that is not necessarily perfect. And what we witness is the result of process. And we cannot assume what the actual process was.
Wonderful. Thank you, Daria, for these wise words. And I love your
Thank you very much for inviting me to your conference.
We are honored to have you here. And I love your term ear tasting or a sound gourmet. I'm going to have to remember these for my own teaching. I'll pass now to Pearl Smiley. Thank you.
Am I audible? Okay.
Yes, we hear you. Thanks.
it's great to, and a luxury in a way, to follow Alice and Daria. And I don't know if it makes my job easier, but it allows me to focus on something that very naturally follows what they've been talking about. And namely that because so much of my electronic music composition was in the context of writing music for theater, I'm zeroing in on that specifically as my topic, because the bottom line of that that's the most important is that electronic sound, whether it's for a theater or a classroom or in your own living room or studio, it has to be effective. It has to communicate. It has to have an end result that has meaning, or it doesn't, but then who would want to listen to it? So in a way, I got a start in writing music for theater even before I had started teaching, or it was the same year I had started teaching. I was just straight out of Bennington College, but I had already been an apprentice for Ussachevsky starting my sophomore year at college. So just picked up a lot of the techniques from him directly, and Alice Shields and I were working on music for some of his film scores. So I was already into music for some other purpose, like film or whatever. And within a year, just by default, and this is the whole story in itself that I said on my podcast, but within a year, I was writing some electronic sounds for a production of Macbeth in the park, Joe Papp doing Macbeth in the park. And he was doing it in Spanish. And he wanted sounds for the witches in Macbeth to not be like normal sounds. They had to be special witch sounds. And he and I worked on it together a little. So this wasn't a whole electronic score, but it was an interesting challenge. And I said, well, what do you picture as witches sounds? And he said, well, of course, I don't know electronic music sounds, but he said, in Spanish, when the witches are talking, and going back and forth, it's very, very angular sounds. And it sounds to someone who only speaks English as very fast moving sounds. So I want you to make sounds that not only sort of echo the sharpness and fast moving, but sounds that will actually move them to emphasize what they're trying to express in those scenes. So that seemed like a tall order. I had only done little exercises for myself. I hadn't had to produce electronic sound for a specific purpose. So that was a challenge. It worked really well, and of course, it had me excited right away to just, wow, this is even more fun than just trying to write my own straight electronic piece. And very shortly after that, actually the next year, through a brother-in-law of mine, Stanley Silverman, who had done some things for Lincoln Center, right away I started writing for music for some of the productions at Lincoln Center. And I think those early experiences with theater, and I was only beginning teaching without my realizing it, really affected how I was teaching, working mostly one-on-one with students, because I was automatically trying, even if there was simple splicing exercises, very minimal analog equipment, but trying to get the most out of shaping sound or sculpting phrases to be effective. Because again, like related to theater, either something's effective or it isn't. It's not, if it's not effective, it doesn't work in a theater sculpture. So it helped a lot in just focusing the way I was trying to have students work with sound and turn it into something that was hopefully musical, or even just interesting if someone wasn't the most musical person in the world. By the way, in those years, electronic music was a required course for graduate composers. So not every graduate composer really wanted to have anything to do with the electronic medium, but they did were usually good-natured about it, and it helped their sense of orchestration, certainly a lot, if they never did electronic music again. So I think the focus of writing music for an audience, that the whole purpose is to impact listeners and to engage them more actively in the theater production, or if it's dance, a dance production. And unlike, for instance, using music to be a background music in theater for a scene that's happening, which might be just no more than background. It's never supposed to be something you're conscious of, but it's just supposed to be there as no more really than setting the mood. I was never called to do those kinds of scenes or purposes in theater. If someone contacted me, it was because they wanted music to be something underneath a scene, or sometimes on top of actors, to really affect actors to be able to literally deliver their lines more from the inside out. And so it meant I was working really directly with actors in rehearsals. In a given play, I'd work with actors in every rehearsal. So it would mean partly just then getting actors' feedback on what was helping them do their lines or have the feeling underneath the lines. Just to give one example, in a production of Macbeth that I did in Stratford, Connecticut, the director had a sort of a wild concept for the whole play. But in the beginning part, he wanted me to write music that both, and more than just background, I was supposed to make a background but a statement and really convey feeling and kind of a conflict between heavenly and demonic sound. And it was supposed to be both of those, heavenly and demonic, simultaneously, both at the same time. And that gets interesting in electronic music. You're not going to, people think heavenly and demonic and they think high and low. You can't just present high and low sounds, then you just have high and low sounds together. But in electronic music, if you're weaving together roughly a heavenly texture or a demonic texture, and you're weaving them in and out of each other, so that while those two textures, which become one complicated lecture, sustain throughout however long it lasts, you're shifting constantly within the texture purposely, so that part of the texture turns in and points a little bit toward the heavenly, and then just when you think, oh, I'm a little more comfortable with that, then you slowly shift it back into more the demonic texture. So it keeps you on your feet. Plus it keeps the actors on their feet. So I found quickly that this really directly influenced actors and how they loved it, because they could feel it on the inside as much as I was. And I think this goes back to what both Alice and Daria have been saying about music, shaping it, what you feel sort of in your body or your whole self, that some of my being able to do that between heavenly and demonic was being raised as a Quaker, and not to get into a long thing about that, but in Quaker thought, there's not, for instance, heaven and hell. Those are opposites, and that's not a good way to think of it. What there is inside yourself, there's lightness and darkness, and you hold those inside yourself. They're on a spectrum. They're not opposites. So I didn't even know that. That's just something I kind of was embedded in me from a long time ago, but I was employing it in exactly like this kind of context between demonic and heavenly, because both of those like sit inside me as part of kind of two ends, but not opposites of a spectrum. So that goes directly into shaping a passage for a theater piece or a theater section. There's a lot of examples of that, but another thing that just was my biggest joy in writing for theater was the use of electronic sound for subliminal purposes, because electronic music is really set up for that in a great way. So that in any scene that I was writing music for just about any play or theater production, you could start with kind of a known sound. I'll pick a simple example, like birds chirping. You could use the sound effects, springtime birds, and just very, very slowly through modulation, you turn the birds into, like, the birds are getting more anxious or nervous, and you may not be conscious of it as a theater person or a listener or whatever. And then, of course, I mean, ultimately, depending if that's what the play is, you could have the chirping birds turn into the kind of birds that were in Hitchcock. Was that one called The Birds? That scary theater piece. So you have birds turn into something that's really menacing, but it's just it's such a natural in electronic music to be working with layers that have different characteristics. And going back to what each Daria and Alice have said, anytime you're doing that, like especially in theater music, you have to just be listening, discerning, playing back, experimenting. And in this case, I'm going to the next rehearsals. The actors are saying, make more of that. I want to drag out my scene longer. Or in some cases in a theater where a piece that I might be recording the actors' sounds and then modifying them in a studio, coming back to a rehearsal, and they would say, oh, I want more of my sounds, make them more high, make them more low. And it was just, it got spoiled in a way with the kind of interaction and compatibility and collaboration there was between me as a composer and the director and the actors. And all this was going on. I got confirmation that the sound and music and what it was, the meaning of it was working before it ever went to opening night. And so that was a luxury too, because it was like self-correction. And I think just when, I certainly employed that working with the students that I was teaching, and it's like something I learned through theater that I could apply in teaching in a classroom, let's say 7 or 8 students, is how the aspect of where silence in a certain context can be even more powerful than sound, or even has to be. And one example we had to do with a sort of a takeoff on The Exorcist, sort of a horror film, feature-length film that I did. And there's one scene where the main actor is going into kind of the equivalent of a haunted house, and he doesn't know, he opens the front door, he goes into the first inner sanctum, and maybe he has to turn a corner to the left, but should he go straight ahead? Should he go up the stairs? And it has to have very scary sound, but just little tidbits of it. And the silence is, as I say, more important than the sound, because in certain parts, depending on what the actor is doing, if you have longer silence, he's getting more nervous and uptight. And so actually the actor would sometimes, when I would go work with the person doing the film editing, and the film editor would have the actor going more slowly up the stairs, in effect. So the silence could get more, the anticipation could make you more nervous. So anyway, there was there's a lot of ways just to apply that kind of discerning and listening and trying to be effective in a class. And how am I doing on time, Zasha? I'm not.
We should probably wrap up soon so that we have time for a couple
I can
questions.
wrap up time.
Yeah,
Okay.
It's been wonderful hearing though.
Okay. Let's see what I can wrap up. I think I've said the main thing, and the last thing I would just say about that was great in a classroom, and it sort of went naturally from having actors give me feedback in rehearsal, but in the classroom, whether it was talking about the balance between sound and silence, or any other aspect, students would be given an assignment, a splicing or more complicated assignment every week or two, and we would all listen to each other's outputs, and the whole class would be kindly critics, of each other's exercises, but really, honest and saying, I don't think that part where you repeated the same sound 10 times, I could have done if you just repeated it 3 times, maybe. I got bored. So that was really valuable because it was more than just me. And if I was teaching 1-on-1, of course it would be me, but it was students, a variety of opinions, not only saying what he or she thought did not work, but why. Right. And it's, again, a basic point, just getting back to keep going back and listening and be kindly critical of yourself and your music. No, not of yourself. Your music. I think I'll end on that note.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Thanks, Pill. And I love how you sort of took your experience from writing music for theater, this sort of collaborative process of speaking with other artists and actors, and then sort of transformed it into your way of teaching in the classroom, of soliciting feedback and creating an environment where people could have that kind of exchange. Really wonderful. Well, if it's all right with the three of you, there are many questions streaming in here and happy comments. I thought maybe we could move to some of those unless anyone has a final remark out of the panelists that they'd like to share. I think it'll segue nicely. So I'm going to begin with a question from, let me find it again, sorry. Oh, it's now disappeared. Okay, I'm going to start out with a question from Kristen Norderval. So she's really enjoying the webinar, and she says that she was curious about some of the other women that were working there, for instance, Ruth Anderson, and was there any collaboration between the CPEMC and the Electronic Music Studio at Hunter College, for instance? Which other female composers were you working with at that time? Yeah, Pril, do you want to begin?
Ruth Anderson worked with me in the Dodge studio. Okay. So I was her teacher initially. She's a very talented composer. I had a lot of admiration for her, and was in very early in the field. And I was so happy when she got to be in charge of the Hunter Center, because it just was a great opportunity for her. And I kept in touch with her. Unfortunately, she passed away recently, but right. I've been in touch with her all the decades since, off and on.
Wonderful. Did any of you want to add to that else? Daria? No? Perhaps we can move to Allison Warren's question. She says, it was fascinating to hear that at the EMC there was such stylistic freedom, which didn't exist in the same way in the Columbia Composition Department at Dodge. So I wonder, did Usachevsky and Arel and Luning also teach there, or only at the EMC? Yeah, go ahead, Alice.
They taught in classes on the campus as well. Well, Usachevsky taught in both places. Luning did not teach electronic music. He was, of a much older generation, did not use the equipment, so he had to work with someone when he wanted to redo a piece of his or something. He didn't teach electronic music. Great. Vladimir Usachevsky taught a number of things, including composition on the campus, which for everyone who doesn't know Columbia is a very significant geographical distance between the Columbia-Princeton Electronic Music Center on 125th Street and the Hudson River and 116th Street and Broadway.
Right.
The center was more or less deliberately placed outside the music department because there was understandable tension when electronic music was established with musicologists and theorists who weren't used to such a thing. It hadn't existed.
Right.
And yeah.
Wonderful. I see we have a question from Elizabeth Hinkle-Turner, and I would just like to thank her for her wonderful scholarship, which has really informed the organizing of this. So she asks, you've touched on it already, but if appropriate, can you speak to one or two particularly influential mentors at the center or mentees of yours out there as well? Maybe each of you can do a quick round. Any mentors or people that you mentored that have been important? Alice, do you want to continue?
Well, I can say that my mentor was Vladimir Ussachevsky,
Right.
to whom I owe my entire career because I was alone on the campus as a woman. Hardly any women were in my composition class, or I didn't start composition until his influence. But when I took his course in 16th century counterpoint, I suddenly understood how composition works and became his assistant. He was enormously helpful to any number of women.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure that I was such a wonderful, mentor to anyone, but people seem to sort of like what I did.
That's great. No, I know your teaching has been important. Daria, would you like to speak? Is there anybody that's helped you along the way?
Well, I think that, as Alice mentioned, there were certain differences between the CPEMC and the campus. So the distance was not only geographical, blocks and blocks away, but also philosophical.
Right.
Where Ussachevsky had a certain aura there. And if anything, for me, that was an example of a way to have a facility which encourages art and artistry, artistic thinking, artistic interaction,
Yes.
and the freedom for individuals to exercise their work there. So for the entire scenario was for me a kind of mentorship. And I was sometimes a bit in conflict with what was going on in that program on campus.
Mm-hmm.
And a few times to the point, I was there as a DMA rep, arranging concerts, etc., and dealing with administration on campus. And so things got a little bit hot to the point where Ussachevsky said to me, I hear you're being belligerent. So to whatever extent I could be belligerent, who knows? I think if anybody had a conversation that wasn't conforming to whatever the aura was or whatever politics were being pushed, then you were out of, not towing the line over there. So I objected to that whole kind of silliness going on and to some of the demands and requirements, which were basically restrictive for creative people and didn't make sense in any way except to conform to other entities in the music department, such as historians or theorists, and their views, which were coming from a place of ignorance, according to me. And I wouldn't mind saying it.
For the record.
That was my belligerence over there.
Wonderful. Brill, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
No, I think we'll just leave it with belligerence. I like that.
Okay. I'm going to do one last question here and then we'll pause for our break. Shane Chapman writes, what technological developments, hardware, software, have had the biggest impact on your compositional process? What do you still do the hard way, for example, working with tape? Maybe we can just do a quick answer from each of you before we close. Alice, yeah, go ahead.
There's no possibility of working with tape of that sort. What was at the center was top-level analog equipment, both the tape recorders, but also hand-made, hand-soldered, beautifully designed, one-of-a-kind, top-level analog sound, top-level mixer, which had practically no sound. You could use that for digital. What the quality of that equipment. There is no analog of that. You can't do it anymore unless someone built it.
Right.
So I have to use total digital.
Daria and Prill, was there any technological development that had a huge impact on you?
Well, I guess I think differently about ingredients rather than thinking in terms of technological specifics or instrumental. I think of things as ingredients for sound. And also if it involves audio-visual, and I think also of our two most keenest defense mechanisms are highly developed in terms of art forms, which is hearing and seeing. And we tend to combine those things as well. And that's our keenest awareness, are most readily available. So I think of possibilities with ingredients, and the most challenging thing really is to make things work and use imagination and what we call creativity and somehow make something interesting enough for myself to continue working in. That is very important as a drive to persist in work and to create something which is original in certain ways to yourself, to create a sort of fingerprint for yourself as an artist in that particular work, as opposed to what? As opposed to keeping on repeating things from piece to piece to piece would not be interesting for someone like me. Now it depends on how somebody wants to work. But I think of choosing ingredients and then pursuing any ways that may realize that project.
Great. Yeah, I guess as a sound gourmet, ingredients are important. And Prill, any
No,
major
I
technological
don't need to
developments?
add.
No, okay. All right. Well, with that, I think we will come to a close. It's just been such a fascinating discussion. I would love to go on and on, but we have many panels today. So thank you so much for giving us these insights into the way you are working and teaching at the center and in your own careers. And this wraps up our keynote panel. We'll take a short break here and we'll return at 2:30 for the panel Early Histories of the CPEMC, which is moderated by Bob Gluck from the University at Albany. So please stay tuned. We're going to just have a slide that comes up and you can go have a coffee break and rejoin us. Thank you again, Alice, Prill, and Daria for your contribution.